20 people have been executed in the state of Indiana. Stephen Timothy Judy, March 9, 1981. He was a mass murderer and suspected serial killer who was convicted of murdering Terry Lee Chastain and her three children, Misty Ann, Steve, and Mark, on April 28, 1979. Judy was raised in a space that was filled with crime, alcohol consumption, violence, and pornography. He was just 13 when he broke into a woman's house, essayed her, and then attempted to kill her with a pocket knife while posing as a Boy Scout. Before he could murder the woman, the pocket knife snapped, but he severed one of her fingers and broke her skull. He was transferred to a psychiatric institution after being found guilty and given a 6-month sentence in a juvenile correctional facility. After being freed, Judy ended up in foster care, living with Robert and Mary Carr, who were unaware of his past. Before heading to work on Saturday, April 28, 1979, Terry Lee Chastain was en route to drop her kids off at a babysitter's house. Judy passed her vehicle while she was driving and gave her a signal telling her to stop. After a while, she did and agreed to Judy's assistance, believing he was a good person. He offered to fix her tire after informing her that there was a problem. He also offered to take Chastain and her three kids on a ride while he checked her tire. After that, he took them to White Lick Creek by car. When they arrived at the creek, Judy led the three kids to a trail and had them walk in front of him and Chastain. Judy essayed Chastain, bound her wrists and ankles, and started choking her once the kids were far away from them. When Chastain screamed for help, her kids rushed back to her. The deaths of Chastain and her three children, Misty, age 5, Stephen, age 4, and Mark, age 2, were discovered by authorities later that day. It was determined that the children had drowned and Chastain had been strangled to death. Eventually, a number of witnesses came forward to support the authorities in identifying the murderer. There was a 2-year emotional outcry following Judy's arrest. He admitted to carrying out the killings and claimed insanity. Judy wanted the punishment phase of the trial to go quickly, so he threatened the jurors and judge, saying he would kill again unless they gave him the death penalty. Judy was proved guilty of killing Chastain and her three children at the conclusion of the trial. On February 25, he was sentenced to death. At the age of 24, Judy was put to death in an electric chair in Michigan City, Indiana, on March 9, 1981. His last meal was dinner rolls, chef salad with French dressing, lobster tails, prime ribs, and potatoes with sour cream. Additionally, he asked for 4 beer cans, but he didn't get those. Since Richard Kiefer was put to death 20 years earlier on June 15, 1961, Judy was the first person executed in Indiana. Judy told his foster mother, Mary Carr, that he had essayed and killed other women in several states and that he murdered more women than he could remember. Last words, "I don't hold no grudges. This is my doing. Sorry it happened." William Earl Vanover, October 16, 1985. He was on death row for murdering his father-in-law, 62-year-old Paul Comiati. Paul Comiati occasionally overindulged in alcohol and became belligerent and aggressive. His wife, Rosemary, son, Paul Jr., and daughter, Mary Ann, were among his close family members who did not like him. Because of Vandiver's criminal history, Paul Sr. had threatened to report him to the police and insisted that Mary Ann divorce him. Vandiver conspired to kill Paul Sr. with the family. There were multiple unsuccessful efforts to poison him. They ultimately made the decision to pump air into his veins and put him under ether. Mary Ann and Vandiver waited outside the house one evening for Paul Jr. to signal that Paul Sr. was sleeping. They entered the residence after noticing the signal and abruptly altered their plan due to ether shortage. Instead, they sprang on Paul Sr. in his bed after entering the bedroom with the intention of suffocating him. Paul Sr. fought back in order to save his own life, and another murder attempt was prevented. But Vandiver put an end to the resistance by stabbing him at least 100 times in the back with a fish fillet knife. The body was eventually found to have 34 severe knife wounds. He was still breathing even after he struck him in the head 5 or 6 times with his revolver, so Vandiver decapitated him. Then, as they joked, Vanover and the other family members divided up the body. Additionally, it was shown that Vanover had obtained $5,000 from Paul Jr., while Rosemary had given him $1,700 and Paul Sr.'s truck. Vanover discarded his earlier admissions throughout the trial and blamed Paul Jr. alone for the killing and dismemberment. Vanover waived appeals and was executed by electric chair. After the initial 2,300 volts, he was still breathing, and 3 more applications of the electricity were required until he passed away. Herbert Shapps, Vanover's lawyer, saw the execution and called it ridiculous. According to the Department of Corrections, the execution did not go according to plan. For his last meal, he shared a pizza with his wife. She was also in prison for her father's murder, but she was allowed to attend her husband's execution. His last words, no comment. Gregory Resnover, December 8, 1994. He was on death row for the murder of Jack Orberg, 44 years old, an Indianapolis police sergeant. Sergeant Jack Orberg and several officers from the Indianapolis Police Department went to North Oxford in Illinois at 5:30 a.m. on December 11, 1980, in an attempt to serve documents on people they thought were there. Orberg repeatedly knocked on the door and introduced himself as a policeman. There were 2 other uniformed officers on the front porch. Orberg squatted and hammered his shoulder against the door, which started to open, after the resident next door informed the police that there was noise coming from within the flat. Officers observed 2 or 3 muzzle flashes coming from 2 different places inside, as well as furniture obstructing the door. Orberg fell on the porch after being shot. A man stepped onto the porch, pointed a weapon, and fired at least 2 more bullets into Orberg as the officers sought cover. Officers retaliated while taking cover, but the gunfire kept coming from inside the house. Gregory Resnover emerged a few minutes later, dropped an AR-15 weapon, and turned himself in. Earl Resnover trailed behind, setting down a handgun and an AR-15. Earl found Orberg's business card in his wallet. Then 2 women emerged, leaving Smith, who was injured, inside. The murder weapon was discovered to be an AR-15 that had been located next to Smith, who was an accomplice. Inside the flat, a collection of firearms and ammo was found. Earlier, on the night of his execution, Resnover handed his attorney, Robert Hammerly, a 3-page statement that Hammerly released at his funeral. The statement read in part, "As to the crime for which I have been put to death, I go to my grave an innocent man. I know that I am not being put to death for what I am supposed to have done 14 years ago, but rather for reasons of politics and the institutional racism in our society." Resnover was black. His victim, Indianapolis police officer Jack Orberg, was white. To Mrs. Orberg, a woman of great dignity, I am truly sorry for the agony that you have endured over the years. I hope that my death in some way helps you heal. At the time of his execution, when asked if he had any last words, he said, "I do not. I made one to my attorney." For his last meal, he ordered deep-fried chicken, whipped potatoes, giblet gravy, Brussels sprouts, lettuce salad with French dressing, cranberry sauce, ice cream with chilled peaches, buttered dinner rolls, milk, sugar, and coffee. Resnover declined the meal when it was served to him. 2 years later, Tommy J. Smith was executed on July 18, 1996. He was a multiple murderer and a career criminal. Smith and his accomplice, Gregory Resnover, ambushed Detective Sergeant Orberg as he attempted to serve arrest warrants on Smith, Gregory Resnover, and Earl Resnover on charges of murder and armed robbery. Smith was executed on the electric chair. Last words, "Let evil prevail where a good man does nothing." There are no records of his final meal. Gary Burris, November 20, 1997. He was on death row for the murder of cab driver Kenneth Chambers, 31 years old. His naked body was discovered face down in an alleyway close to Fall Creek Parkway in a pool of his frozen blood. He had a small caliber gunshot wound to his right temple, and his hands were bound behind his back. Burris had called for a cab according to the cab company log, and it was Chambers' final fare. According to a witness, Burris brought a clipboard, a cab driver's run sheet, and large sums of cash back to his flat with Emmett Merriweather and James Thompson. Later that day, Burris was taken into custody at his girlfriend's apartment after a .38 caliber revolver was discovered concealed in a stereo speaker. It was verified as the murder weapon by the ISP lab. Chambers' taxi was discovered parked close by. Later, Burris admitted to a fellow prisoner that he had shot Chambers in the head as he was pleading for his life and had him lie face down on the icy floor. Afterwards, accomplice Thompson was found guilty and given a 50-year prison term. Accomplice Merriweather was given a 15-year prison sentence after testifying at both trials. Burris shouldn't have been put to death according to those opposed to the death sentence. After accidentally shooting himself with his own revolver during a robbery attempt in 1976, Burris suffered brain damage according to Amnesty International, and he was given a dismal defense at his murder trial. Jurors were unaware of his upbringing, surrounded by drug dealers and prostitutes during the penalty phase of the trial. Burris had been told that when he was a baby, his biological mother had left him in a garbage can. In a 1991 court case, he was given a second death sentence. However, 11 hours prior to Burris's November 1995 meeting with the executioner, an appeals court judge stopped the proceedings to examine his complicated legal background. After considering his case, a number of justices, including the U.S. Supreme Court, determined that he should be put to death. His last words were, "Hopefully the Chambers family will find peace. James Thompson did not know what was going on. I wish the world well. Beam me up." For his last meal, he had steak and lobster, salad with Thousand Island dressing and blue cheese topping, and 2 espressos. Robert Allan Smith, January 29, 1998. Smith was incarcerated at the Indiana Wabash Correctional Institution, where he was serving a 38-year term for battery. Smith stabbed inmate Michael Wedmore 37 times in partnership with inmate Lunsford. Correctional officers observed the attack. Smith and Lunsford both turned over the murder weapons and quickly surrendered. Smith then agreed to a death sentence after entering a guilty plea. Smith told the court during the guilty plea hearing, "I am telling the court that the next person I go at won't be a baby killer. It will be a state employee and I will butcher him." In Hamilton County, the inmate they stabbed, Wedmore, was serving a 60-year term for killing his girlfriend's 2-year-old child. Accomplice Lunsford was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Smith's last words were, "I'm ashamed of the way I lived my life, and I pray God will forgive me. I hope the angels are flying close to the ground. I'm sorry I helped make the world the way it is today." His last meal had steak, lobster, shrimp cocktail, chicken livers, fried eggplant, meatballs, salad with blue cheese dressing, a loaf of bread, an entire Boston cream pie, and Dr. Pepper, 3 cans of Dr. Pepper to be more specific. D. H. Fleenor, December 9, 1999. He was on death row for murdering Nyla Harlow, 49, and Bill Harlow, 58, his parents-in-law. His estranged wife, Sandra Saddam, and her parents, Bill and Nyla Harlow, joined Fleenor during an evening church session. After a short time, he departed. Fleenor showed up in the hallway when Sandra and her parents got home, and he shot Bill with a .22 he had bought earlier that day. Sandra, her mother, and her 3 grandkids were told to sit on the couch by Fleenor. He gave Nyla permission to see her spouse. Nyla was shot in the head by Fleenor as she helped Bill to the ground. Sandra and the kids were told to carry her body to the bedroom. After making Sandra drive to her brother's house to inform him that they would be gone for a few days, he drove back to the Harlow residence. Bill asked about his wife as he was still alive. "I can't let him suffer," Fleenor declared before shooting him to death. Fleenor left to Tennessee the following morning, taking Sandra and the kids with him. It took 4 days for the bodies to be found. Fleenor was apprehended by police at his family's Tennessee residence. Fleenor claimed to have been under the influence of narcotics, alcohol, and mental stress when he entered a not guilty plea by reason of insanity. He was convicted on December 1st, 1983, following a trial in Johnson County. The death punishment was the jury's recommendation, and the judge agreed. His last words were, "I am not guilty, and I forgive those that are having to do this. I was of an unsound mind when I did it. I would like to let my mother know I forgive her and I love her." He appears to have had two special meals, a breakfast consisting of pancakes, cereal, milk and coffee, and a lunch of turkey, beets, macaroni with tomato sauce, and fried apples. James Lowery, June 27, 2001. He was on death row for the murders of his former employers, Mark and Gertrude Thompson, both 80 years old. Both were discovered dead from gunshot wounds in their West Point, Indiana country house. Lowery and his wife had previously worked as caretakers for the Thompsons. The Thompsons requested that the Lowerys depart because they were unhappy with them. Lowery informed his friend Jim Bennett he knew where he might obtain some money, and the two spoke about a robbery. Bennett picked Lowery up on September 30, 1979, and did as Lowery instructed him to do. Lowery informed Bennett that they were coming to the Thompsons' home to kill and bury both Thompsons after making the men write a $9,000 check. Lowery, carrying a pistol and a sawed-off shotgun, kicked in the door of the trailer next to the Thompsons' garage where Janet Brown, their cleaner and caretaker, was sitting. They talked for a while before Lowery made her take him into the Thompsons' home. Mark Thompson was standing in the kitchen when Lowery led Brown inside. He shot Thompson in the stomach after telling him he was being held up. After forcing Mrs. Thompson into the kitchen, Lowery proceeded to another room and shot her in the head. He also shot Brown, but when Lowery fired at her, Brown put her hand over her head, injuring both her hand and her head, but managing to survive. When a burglar alarm started to sound, Lowery got excited. Before leaving the scene, he returned and shot Mr. Thompson in the head. In his evidence during the penalty phase, Lowery acknowledged the killings. Bennett testified against Lowery in his initial trial, entered a guilty by agreement plea, and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. A second trial ended with the same outcome after the first one was reversed on direct appeal for failing to sequester the jury. Bennett declined to testify in the second trial, and his earlier testimony was used against Lowery, who was given a second death sentence on January 7, 1983. For his last words, he chose to make a statement to his attorney instead of saying something at his execution. The statement said the following: "I also want to apologize to my family and tell them how much I have appreciated their love and support. No one should have endured the pain of seeing their loved ones murdered or killed for any reason. The Thompsons should have been allowed to live out their remaining years in peace and live with dignity." He did not ask for any special last meal. Kevin Lee Hough, May 2, 2003. Ted Boesler and Gene Rubrek, his cousin's landlords, infuriated Hough. The landlords seized his cousin's belongings when he neglected to pay rent. Hough visited his Fort Wayne home with his brother, Dwayne Lapp, to get the property back. After inviting them inside, Hough took out a .45 automatic weapon as they descended the stairs. Hough shot Rubrek in the chest as he swiped at him. Hough shot Boesler in the back as he fell to the ground. Then Hough struck Rubrek in the face once more. Hough left with a beer that he believed might have fingerprints on it and the TV remote control. Lapp was the state's most prominent witness during the trial. In a separate trial, Hough was also convicted of murdering Anthony Bartowiak during a home invasion 11 days before the murder of Boesler and Rubrek. His last words were, "I hope the victim's family sees some measure of satisfaction. Hopefully, their grief will be okay." He did not want a last meal. Joseph Trueblood, June 13, 2003. Susan Boucher, his ex-girlfriend, had stated that she intended to make amends with her ex-husband, which infuriated Trueblood. One day, while Susan and her two young children were being picked up by Trueblood, he shot Susan 3 times in the head and each child once. He then borrowed a shovel, drove to his twin brother's house, confessed what he had done, and buried the 3 of them in a shallow grave in a remote location. Trueblood expressed a wish to enter a guilty plea and did so following the testimony of 4 witnesses during the trial. Trueblood told the probation officer that Susan had shot the children before taking her own life and then tried to recant his guilty plea, but it was denied. His last words, "My attorney has my last statement." He did not have a final meal. However, according to a report, Trueblood, with some family and friends and a priest, shared candy, potato chips, and a Coke from a vending machine. Donald Ray Wallace Jr., March 10, 2005. Thomas Snyder, an Indiana state trooper, was called to Ralph Hendricks's reported burglarized residence on January 14, 1980. Trooper Snyder visited the Gilligan's residence, which is next to the Hendricks one, as part of the investigation to ask if the occupants had heard or seen anything strange. The back entrance of the house had a shattered window. 4 dead bodies were found in the family room when Snyder went inside the residence. They were Teresa and Patrick Gilligan, along with their 2 kids, ages 5 and 4. The 2 children were bound together, and Mrs. Gilligan's hands were tied behind her. David Wilson, MD, the coroner, stated in his testimony that gunshot wounds caused brain damage in all 4 fatalities. Wallace was identified as the perpetrator and given the death penalty. His last words were, "I hope everyone can find peace with this." His last meal consisted of filet mignon, baked potato, soup, and chocolate truffle cake. William Benefield Jr., April 21, 2005. He was on death row for the murder of 19-year-old Dolores Wells. She disappeared in January 1987 in Terre Haute, Indiana. A surviving victim, 17-year-old Alicia, who was abducted by Benefield while carrying a gun and wearing a mask while traveling to a store in Terre Haute, provided evidence for the state's case. After being gagged and restrained, Alicia was driven to Benefield's house and brought inside. Alicia was held captive in Benefield's house for 4 months, during which time she was essayed and sodomized more than 60 times while being held at gunpoint. She spent the majority of this time tied and chained to a bed. He placed toilet paper in her mouth, taped her eyes shut, and cemented her eyelids shut. She was beaten, and he cut her with a knife. 3 months later, Alicia noticed Dolores Wells, a second girl, living with them. She was handcuffed on the bed, naked, her lips and eyes taped shut. She witnessed Benefield beating Dolores and pinching her nose shut after applying superglue. After spending 2 hours away from the house, Benefield came back and told Alicia that he had killed and buried Dolores. Benefield shoved Alicia into a crawl space in the ceiling when the police knocked on the door. She was saved by the police after they entered with a search warrant. Soon after, Dolores's body was discovered in a wooded area. An autopsy determined that hypoxia was the cause of death, and they also found damage to her private parts. In 1988, a jury convicted him of murder, essay, criminal imprisonment, and deviant conduct, and he was condemned to death. In the years that followed, his attorneys claimed he suffered from mental illness, but the court nonetheless ordered the execution to go forward despite his not guilty plea due to insanity. His last words were, "Let's get this over with, let's do it." His final meal consisted of pizza, a beef sandwich, 4 pints of Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and about 12 soft drinks. Gregory Scott Johnson, May 25, 2005. He was on death row for the murder of 82-year-old Ruby Hutzler. When Ruby Hutzler's house caught fire, a newspaper delivery boy alerted a neighbor to call the authorities. He came back, but the smoke and flames prevented him from entering the house. In roughly 30 minutes, firefighters were able to extinguish that fire. Ruby Hutzler was discovered 5 feet from the front entrance with 20 cracked ribs and broken bones on her cheek and nose. She also had fractures to her spine and larynx. According to an autopsy, she died from these wounds rather than from breathing in smoke or fire. Johnson was listed as a suspect in multiple local fires, according to a dispatch. He was detained for public intoxication when officers observed him watching the firefighters battling the fire. While in jail, Johnson acknowledged starting 4 recent fires in the neighborhood, but first denied any participation. Johnson was questioned subsequently about if he was attempting to join his friend Mark Weishart on death row by killing Hutzler. Johnson broke down and made a complete confession. He was a prosecution witness who testified against his friend Mark Weishart, who was accused of capital murder. Johnson claimed that after using a broom to smash a front window to gain entry, he confronted 90-pound Hustler in her pajamas right away. Slumping to the ground, Hustler gasped for air. Johnson claimed that when he was moving about the home, he stomped on her. He found some matches, took a watch and silver dollars, lit a fire, and ran away. His last words were, "Everyone has been professional." His last meal consisted of barbecued ribs, pulled pork sampler, sautéed mushrooms, and Oreo pie. Kevin Aaron Connor, July 27, 2005. He was on death row for murdering 4 people. Connor was having a drink with friends Bruce Voge, Tony Moore, and Steve Wentland at Moore's house. With Connor in the back and Moore in the front, Wentland went for a drive. After an argument, Moore used Connor's knife to strike Wentland. Moore pursued and ran over Wentland after he jumped out of the car. Then Connor killed him with a knife. Connor and Moore got into a heated argument about the previous night's events when they drove to Connor's employee's warehouse. Connor used a shotgun to kill Moore. Then Connor came back to Moore's house and shot Voge on the sofa. After that, Connor ran away to Texas. He was just 22 years old at the time of the murders. Connor also claimed to have killed a fellow death row inmate in 2002, Jerry Thompson, who was 41 years old. His last words were, "Everyone has to die sometimes. Let's get on with the killing." His last meals, 4 chili dogs, onion rings, banana split, and Oreo blizzard. Allan Lemon Matheney, September 28, 2005. On March 4, 1989, while on an 8-hour leave from prison, he was found guilty of using a shotgun to bludgeon his ex-wife Lisa Bianco to death. He was incarcerated at Pendleton Correctional Facility at the time of the battery and confinement of Bianco. Matheney traveled to St. Joseph County, even though the 8-hour release permission allowed him to go just to Indianapolis. He grabbed an unloaded shotgun from a friend's house and changed. In Mishawaka, he parked his car 2 homes away from Bianco's residence. He followed her down the street after breaking in through the rear door of her home. While his 2 daughters and many neighbors watched, he captured her and used the shotgun to beat her to death. Nevertheless, this lawsuit was delayed for 16 years due to appeals. As a result of the case, Indiana law was changed to make sure victims are notified in the event that an offender was freed. Additionally, the state consented to compensate Bianco's estate with $900,000. He claimed he was legally insane during his trial. He was diagnosed with schizophreniform disorder by one mental health expert and paranoid personality disorder with psychotic delusions by another. However, at the time of the crime, none of them claimed he was legally insane. According to Matheney, he thought Bianco was plotting against him. On September 19, he declined to show up for an Indiana parole board hearing. Then, on September 24, 2005, the Indiana Supreme Court denied a motion for a new trial by a vote of 5-0. On September 27, Governor Mitch Daniels finally refused to grant clemency. His last words were, "I love my family and my children. I'm sorry for the pain I caused them. I thank my friends who have stood by me, especially Pat and Rehanna and Beverly and Lois. I am sure my grandchildren will grow up healthy and happy in the care of their wonderful parents." His last meal consisted of fried chicken with extra order of spicy wings, corn on the cob, potato wedges, biscuits, chocolate milkshake. Marvin Bieghler, January 27, 2006. He was on death row for the murders of Tommy Miller, 21, and his pregnant wife Kimberly, 19. Bieghler ran a Mary Jane buying and selling business. He distributed drugs through Tommy Miller. He believed Miller was snitching on him when one of Bieghler's top agents was detained and a sizable cargo was confiscated. When Bieghler and his bodyguard Brooke arrived at Miller's trailer outside of Kokomo, Bieghler entered and used a .38 handgun to shoot Tommy Miller and his expectant wife Kimberly as his security waited outside. Near every body, he left a penny. In Florida, he was later taken into custody. Brock struck a deal and was the state's most prominent witness during the trial. Even though the gun was never located, 938 casings that were discovered at the site matched those that were discovered at Bieghler's usual target shooting range. The brother of the male victim, Kenneth Miller, discovered the Millers' bodies on December 11, 1981, in their Rushville mobile home. Kimberly was 5 to 8 weeks pregnant. The Millers' then 2-year-old son witnessed their deaths. Tommy Miller was shot in the chest 6 times. His wife was shot 3 times in the chest. Bieghler's last words were, "Let's get it over with." His last meal consisted of black bean soup, mushroom Dijon, a blooming onion, salad, New York steak, shrimp, chicken, baked potato, cheesecake, and 7-Up. David Leon Woods, May 4, 2007. He was on death row for the murder of 77-year-old Juan Plasencia. To steal a television, Woods, Greg Sloan, and Pat Sweet headed to Juan Plasencia's house in Garrett, Indiana. Woods had a knife in his hand. Woods and Sloan rang the doorbell as Sweet remained in the yard. Woods leaped in and stabbed Plasencia with the knife as soon as he responded. He repeatedly stabbed him when he fell back and cried out for assistance, then stole cash from his wallet. The TV was then brought out, concealed, and eventually sold by Woods and Sloan. They hurled the knife into the creek and cleaned their clothing. Woods was sobbing on the porch of Plasencia's apartment complex when police came the following morning in response to a complaint about a man in need of assistance. He claimed to have gone there to use the phone and discovered him dead. Woods' mother arrived on the scene and informed police she believed her son was involved in the murder while questioning him. When she allowed her home to be searched, a stained towel and a knife sheath were found. After being brought to the police, Woods broke down and made the full confession while the polygraph was being prepared. Sloan pleaded guilty to aiding in murder and testified during the trial. Woods' last words were, "Well, I want everybody to know that I do have peace, and that it's through Jesus Christ that I have this peace, and I want them to carry it on. I want them to have peace within themselves, and that I want Juan's family to know I am truly sorry. I do have remorse. God be with everybody here." His last meal consisted of a pizza and cola. Michael Allan Lambert, June 15, 2007. After being called to a traffic accident, Muncie police officers noticed an abandoned utility truck. Lambert was seen crawling beneath a car close by after the truck was towed. Officer Kirk Mace detained Lambert for public intoxication after he told officers he was trying to sleep after spending the majority of the night drinking. Officer Greg Winters patted him down and loaded him into the back of a police vehicle to take him to jail. After a few minutes, the police car was seen slipping into a ditch after going off the road. Officer Winters had been shot 5 times in the neck and back of the skull, and Lambert was still in handcuffs in the back seat. There was a .25 handgun on the floorboard. Later on, it was discovered that Lambert had taken the .25 handgun from his boss. Evidence included a demonstration reenactment film that showed how a handcuffed person may retrieve and shoot a gun. Lambert was just 20 years old at the time of the murder. At 36, he was executed by lethal injection. Some 20 police cars arrived at the prison about 2 hours before the execution, bringing dozens of officers and others from Muncie and elsewhere, including LaPorte, Mishawaka, South Bend, and Gary. As they awaited word of the execution, they held blue glow sticks given to them by the widow of Officer Greg Winters to represent the thin blue line he was on the night he was killed. Because he was so drunk at the time of the crime, Lambert maintained his claim he did not remember how it happened. He said it made no sense to him why he would murder the officer just because he was accused of public intoxication, which is not that serious in the grand scheme of things. He had no final words, and he did not want a special last meal. Matthew Eric Wrinkles, December 11, 2009. He was on death row for multiple murders. Wrinkles killed his brother-in-law, Tony Fulkerson, Fulkerson's wife, Natalie Fulkerson, and his estranged wife, Deborah Jean Wrinkles, at their Evansville home on July 21, 1994. Since her divorce from Wrinkles, Deborah Wrinkles and her 2 kids had been residing with the Fulkersons. Wrinkles attributed his behavior to his methamphetamine addiction. Wrinkles' mother had attempted to have him committed to a mental hospital 2 weeks prior to the killings because of his unpredictable conduct, but she was told he did not fit the requirements. He was subsequently admitted to another hospital where a psychiatrist determined after 3 days of testing that he was not gravely disabled and released him. Despite a protective order in place, Wrinkles proceeded to see Deborah at her workplace and at the houses of 2 of her acquaintances after his release and insisted on seeing her. Every time he failed. Wrinkles, his wife, and their lawyers convened for a provisional hearing in their divorce case on July 20, 1994. They decided to grant Wrinkles visitation rights and to revoke the protection order. Additionally, they decided that later that day, Deborah and Wrinkles would meet with the kids at a restaurant, but Deborah decided not to follow through on that plan. Later that evening, Wrinkles drove to Tony and Natalie Fulkerson's house while wearing camouflage clothes and face paint. He was carrying a knife and a pistol. He parked the car a block away, and then he kicked in the back door, then disconnected the telephone wires. Wrinkles killed Deborah in the hallway with a gunshot wound to her shoulder and chest, Natalie on the front porch with a bullet wound to her face, and Tony in the bedroom with 4 gunshot wounds to his face, hip, chest, and back. The murder weapon was found at Wrinkles' cousin's house, where he was eventually taken into custody. On June 14, 1995, he was found guilty of the killings and given the death penalty. An execution date of December 11, 2009 was issued on November 3, 2009, following the Indiana Supreme Court's denial of Wrinkles' final review motion. A week later, Wrinkles was confronted by relatives of his victims when he appeared as a guest on a portion of the Oprah Winfrey Show via remote feed from the prison. On December 9, Wrinkles' last meal consisted of prime rib, loaded baked potatoes, pork chops with fries, buns, and 2 salads with ranch dressing. Due to the belief that a condemned prisoner's appetite diminishes as the execution date draws near, Indiana serves the customary final meal 3 days before the execution. While being escorted to the execution house on the grounds of Indiana State Prison, Wrinkles yelled, "I'll see you fellas," along the cell block corridor as a final farewell, according to fellow inmate Rick Parrish, who made this observation in a 2013 documentary. Wrinkles died at 12:39 a.m. on December 11, 2009, as planned, after being executed by lethal injection. He was 49 years old. Wrinkles refused to provide a final statement, stating only, "Let's get it done, let's lock and load, it's plagiarized, but what the hell." Capital punishment is still legal in the state of Indiana. Right now, 8 people are on death row there awaiting execution. Watch this video next if you want to know their stories.